Hello and welcome to Dialogue. I'm Yang Rui and live in Beijing. Following his fence-mending tour of Beijing, U.S. Defense Secretary Robert Gates has started his journey of solidarity to Japan to strengthen the traditional alliance between Tokyo and Washington. Japan is quickly upgrading its national defense program guideline in response to the alleged threats from the DPRK and China's growing military capabilities. To take a closer look, we are joined here by General Zu Cheng Hu with China's National Defense University of the PLA and Mr. Blackburn-Dwyer and Mr. Yoichi Shimatsu, former editor of Japan Times. But before we get started, let's look at this.
Where U.S. Navy Commander Matthew Perry first opened the door to Japan in 1853, and it's now the biggest American military base in the West Pacific, as well as the headquarters of the 7th Fleet, that country's largest overseas maritime squadron. It's also the only place in the region that can diagnose aircraft carrier problems. Once harbored the renowned Kitty Hawk warship, it is now the home to the George Washington Strike Group. The naval command for the Japanese Self-Defense Force is also located here. The combination is symbolic when it comes to military ties between the two sides, since Yokosuka is just one of the 40 U.S. military bases currently located in Japan. Altogether, those posts house 47,000 soldiers, with 20,000 stationed in Okinawa Prefecture. This number has fluctuated over the years. Although the number of facilities dropped recently, the amount of land used, which is so precious to an island country, has not changed much. These bases served important strategic and logistic purposes in almost every conflict the U.S. has participated in since the end of the World War II. The seemingly close partnership is often clouded by Japan's anti-U.S. mood as far as its military presence is concerned, especially after becoming one of the world's largest economies. This sentiment climaxed in 1995 when the rape of a Japanese girl by American soldiers ignited a mass campaign against Futama Air Base. Okinawa residents have continually demanded the facility's removal, but its future remains unresolved. A number of security treaties were also signed over the years, ranging from granting the U.S. rights to set up bases to returning some of the sites to Japan. This suits the wishes of both sides. For the Japanese, a stronger and more independent powerhouse, and for the Americans, pushing their ally to shoulder more responsibility for its own defense. Though apparently integrated into the world's largest war machine, Japan is now paying more than $2 billion per year for these bases. This is about a third of the total costs for these venues. The scope and frequency of joint military exercises has dwindled since the end of the Cold War, but last month the two armies launched their biggest drill ever as tensions ran high on the Korean peninsula. CCTV.
Welcome back to the studio discussion here. My first question goes to Mr. Yoichi Shimatsu. What do you think is the purpose of Secretary Robert Gates' current visit to Japan?
Well, I think underlying the visit is that he's soon going to retire from his position. And I think the reason for that is he's been very hesitant to impose the kind of budget cuts that Congress and the Office of Management and Budget want him to impose on the U.S. military. The cuts he's suggesting so far are half of what Congress has recommended. So we have a situation here on one hand where American and Japanese and South Korean military forces are trying to forward base a lot of firepower toward the West, toward China. But on the other hand, they're facing really serious round of budget cuts coming up due to the massive debt and deficits that the United States and Japan are running. So in the short run, we're seeing a buildup of forces, but in the medium term, what we're seeing is far fewer resources being allocated for defense purposes. So the situation is one where I think Gates is trying to not allow a power vacuum to open up in the interim between his retirement and the coming in of his successor, whoever that is going to be, who is going to really chop this defense budget down to size.
Brandon, what's your response?
Well, first of all, I would disagree with some of the facts on the table in that one. The Office of Management and Budget has suggested a larger cut than Secretary Gates. Much of Congress has actually derided Secretary Gates' cuts as too big, particularly with the Republican Congress coming in the House. There's a lot of concern that Secretary Gates' rather, I think, economical cuts and rather effective from a military point of view cuts won't actually be upheld because the Congress will want their home districts to get money. But when you're looking specifically at this trip, it's really not about the home front, it's really about Asia as a whole. Secretary Gates made a trip to China. It was very important. It had been much ballyhooed, and I think that even though it didn't come with any headline-grabbing breakthroughs, that it was really important to the relationship. As such, he needs to go further. He needs to step up the relationship with Japan. We've seen a lot of trilateral talks between the United States, Japan, and the ROK over the last few months. This is simply an extension of that. With Prime Minister Nato Khan's visit upcoming to the United States, this is an important stepping stone to set up that visit. As such, his visit to Japan isn't about him stepping down from his position within the year. It's actually about just continuing the Japanese-United States military cooperation.
General Zhu, if Secretary Robert Gates is supposed to brief his Japanese counterpart about the achievements that he made during the 4-day official visit to Beijing, what do you think he's going to tell the Japanese about the military-to-military ties between the PLA of China and the U.S.?
I think Bob will have many to tell because this visit is a very important visit. This marks the restart of the high-level military exchanges. And besides that, I think during his stay in Beijing, Bob discussed with Chinese military leaders a series of issues. For example, increase the cooperation in disaster relieving, increase the exchanges in the low-level and the middle-level ranking officers, and the increase of the exchanges between the medical cares and increase in the exchanges between different professional sectors. I think all these are achievements of his visit during his stay in Beijing.
Was he impressed by the visit to the missile command headquarters, the 2nd Artillery headquarters?
This is not new because the former Defense Secretary of the United States visited the command headquarters of the 2nd Artillery of the Chinese military. And I think this is an embodiment of China's confidence and openness to the United States. And this also shows that China attaches great importance to the meal-to-meal ties between these two countries.
Yoichi, do you think the growing confidence of the Chinese military is a curse for the Japanese self-defense forces, and therefore they are crying foul and they cause attention to the rise of China in Asia for the fear of losing your regional leadership, and this may create the excuse for hawks in the Japanese military industry to develop your military industry?
Well, I think the modernization of the Chinese military is inevitable. I don't think China wants to follow the path of Yugoslavia, where weakness invites aggression. But on the other hand, I think the timing of some of the breakthroughs, the technical breakthroughs that the Chinese military designers are making now, that comes at a time again of rising debt and deficit in Japan and the United States. And this is posing problems. For example, there's been a huge alarm in Japan about Secretary Gates' discussion of the new Chinese stealth fighter, the J-20 fighter, which caused a huge stir in Japan. And this partly, I think, is seen as an attempt by the Pentagon and Lockheed Martin to sell the F-35 stealth fighter to Japan, which Japan doesn't want. The F-35 has a bad service record. I think RAND analysts has said that this plane doesn't turn, it doesn't climb, and it doesn't run. It's basically a flying coffin.
It's basically a piece of garbage.
Yeah, and this is what the United States wants to sell to Japan, when Japan wants the F-22 instead, a much more costly fighter. And I think this is a real problem. But there's not the money for that. And also the costs are rising because the U.S. orders for these planes are also declining. So it's a real quandary where China has the money to modernize. The United States and Japan are going to be seeing less and less money to upgrade their forces.
Brandon, what's the essence of the current visit by Secretary Robert Gates to Japan in terms of the financial mutual support, financially mutual support. Does the Pentagon or is it looking at the deep pocket of the Japanese Ministry of Finance so that the Japanese ally could flex its financial muscles to support not only the fueling mission on the Indian Ocean and to sustain the military operations in Afghanistan, but also to use the DPRK as a common threat in an effort to beef up the traditional military alliance?
Well, I think on one hand, the Japanese don't really have the deep pocket that you're talking about. I mean, there is a willingness to spend money on military items, but it's not exactly the deep pocket that it might have been, say, 10 or 15 years ago. As Yoichi has pointed out, I think time and time again, there's been budget cuts, and there's going to be budget cuts. The reality is that part of Secretary Gates' trip is to set up the buying of advanced next-generation fighters, the so-called fourth-generation fighters, be it the F-22, which is what the Japanese want, but is incredibly costly, or the F-35, which Lockheed Martin and some of the U.S. forces are sort of saying we'd like you to buy because it's cheaper. The reality, though, is that both sides are looking at developments in Asia, specifically in the short term about North Korea, and trying to say, what can we do to make ourselves strong? What can we do to continue to make ourselves strong? And the reality is that Japan is going to have to continue to modernize, just as China is modernizing with the J-20 and various other forces upgrades.
We drew a lot of inspirations from the First and Second Gulf Wars initiated by the Pentagon in terms of how to develop the high-tech military, cutting-edge military hardware. General Zhu, I wonder if a stealth fighter jet like a J-20 can make China stronger militarily. What do you think of the dramatic aspects of releasing the sensitive information about the stealth technology?
I don't think it is intentionally released at this moment.
You don't think so?
No, I don't think so.
But it's too dramatic because it happens to coincide with the visit of the U.S. Defense Secretary.
Because it's well planned, well advanced in advance, but no, it's not planned intentionally for this purpose.
For a country that constantly talks about the United States not understanding symbolism or different issues being done to offend China in different situations, the fact that this wouldn't have been planned to coincide with Secretary Gates' visit seems completely tone deaf to me. It's not that I think this was thumbing their nose in the United States, but I think it was definitely intended to be it. If it wasn't, they would have waited a week to run this test. I understand it was within their planned ideas, but it's important to show Secretary Gates and the world, while we're talking about military-to-military ties with the United States, that China has made a giant leap forward in its development.
It's a great leap forward,
is a giant leap forward.
General, isn't a great leap forward?
It's an important leap forward for the manufacture of the technology. I mean, technologies in making the fighters, at least the fourth generation of fighters. This is a very, very important advance for Chinese military or defense industry.
There's no question about the progressive nature and about the cutting-edge military hardware of the stealth fighter jet that was staged in Chengdu, Sichuan province. Don't go away, we'll be right back after this short break.
Nurtured in spring, sweetened to perfection, ripening in May, Chongqing oranges.
New shipping hub in Northeast Asia, reaching the world from Northeast China, port of Dandong.
We debate and discuss to push the envelope. China needs dialogue to facilitate integration. We call for deep, intellectual,
Use its yuan.
assertive,
It is the fundamental problem.
level playing, observant,
In an age of multilateralism,
graceful, universal elevation. This is dialogue, where ideas do matter.
Welcome back. You are watching our edition of Dialogue discussing the implications of the current visit by Secretary Robert Gates to Japan to consolidate their traditional alliance. We are joined here live by General Zu Cheng Hu with the China National Defense University of the PLA, Mr. Brandon Blackburn-Dwyer, our World Affairs commentator, and Mr. Yoichi Shimatsu, former editor of Japan Times. Gentlemen, welcome back. General Zhu, do you think China is a threat? Because we have spent so much money constructing Navy, Blue Water Navy, developing second artillery. We are talking about achieving the breakthrough by breaking the first island chain, second, third. And a lot of the angry youth on the internet are talking happily about why we shouldn't have a showdown with the U.S. military or even defeat the Japanese or the ROK, whatever. I mean, those kind of radical words could often be heard.
Yes, it's understandable because Chinese have been bullied by many of the imperialist powers for more than 200 years, ever since ever since 1840, the first Opium War. This is
we have a
bitter memory for the Chinese. Yes. But I don't think the Chinese military development is a threat to neighboring countries, because on the one hand, the security environment of China is the most complicated one among all major powers. We need to protect our security and territorial integrity and sovereignty.
What do you mean by the most complicated security environment?
By saying that, I mean China is facing all the challenges and the threats that the others are facing, while China is also facing a lot of challenges and threats which are not faced by other major powers. For example, the three evil forces, as we mentioned, in China.
In Central Asia.
Yeah, in Central Asia, even in Taiwan and Tibet. So this is only one aspect of that. As you know, with the growing of the national comprehensive strength of China, China will have to contribute more to world peace and security and stability. For example, in the past, we have never sent warships to carry out those sort of cruise to counter piracies in Red Sea or in the maritime area of Somalia. This has never been done before. Now we have to do it because China is growing. And to do that, we need to develop our military capability. And we have to protect the safety and the security of the sea lanes of communications, because China is becoming increasingly dependent on this sort of lanes. And of course, these sea lanes are the sea lanes of the world community instead of only China's.
Why is China accused of scaring its neighboring countries in the disputed waters of the South China Sea?
To be very frank, I believe that the South China Sea in the past years has been very stable. The situation is quite good. China didn't take any provocative action in South China Sea. Furthermore, China has established some of mechanisms in cooperation with some of the disputing countries, like Vietnam. We have joint patrol in the Northern Bay and the disputed areas.
We have carried out joint patrols with the Vietnamese?
Vietnamese military, Vietnamese Navy. So this is not... I don't think the situation there is as worse as somebody in the West said. I think the situation there is quite stable. I don't think this Chinese is taking any provocative or aggressive action against any neighboring country or disputing party.
Brandon, do you have any different interpretations about the military buildup of the PLA?
Well, I think that overall, some of this is just the reality of the situation. China is a global power. It's very quickly approaching in all aspects, not just economics, to be the second largest country in the world or second most powerful country in the world. And as part of that is going to be a military buildup. The question is always...
Is that justifiable? Is it reasonable for China to have corresponding military buildup after our economy has grown so fast?
I think it's reasonable. The question, though, with everybody is always why. That is always the first question. While it's not unreasonable...
Why? Tell him why.
Because we need to make greater contribution to peace and the stability of the world.
Well, as General Zhu has inclined about the South China Sea, he doesn't believe there's been any provocative actions, which I would from at least a rhetorical point of view, say that there has been some provocative actions over the past year. The larger issue is what threat is China under? What threat is under? I mean, the United States, the other largest military in the world, or the largest military in the world, has provided no threat to China. Yet, with developments like the anti-carrier missile, with the developments of the J-20, with the development of anti-satellite technology and weaponry, those are all items aimed at advanced militaries like the United States.
Yeah. What's your response?
I think I cannot agree with you. I think the series of actions like close-range reconnaissances, like large-scale exercises, like invitation of China's reconnaissance ships to the western coast of United States, all this send China a signal. China is not strong enough militarily. China has to develop itself. This is my perception from a series of actions taken by the United States in the past few years.
Are you talking about the very dangerous provocational behavior by the U.S. warplanes and warships near the economic zones of China? Let's have a perspective from Yoichi Shimatsu.
Well, certainly China is not alone in upgrading its military capability. I think in both China, with China, South Korea and Japan, all are focused on this whole maritime development, of naval development, and with very much high technology. So we're seeing anti-submarine warfare being upgraded. We're seeing submarines, super silent submarines. All three countries are working on those and producing them as fast as they can. We're seeing, if not Aegis destroyers, we're also seeing, let's say, destroyers and cruisers with electronic countermeasures, which can defend themselves from incoming missiles, and also developments of special forces units, which could fight over these disputed islands. You know, very well-trained special units of soldiers who are highly mobile can come in and do, let's say, nighttime raids to occupy these islands. All three countries are involved in this, so there is an arms race in East Asia, even without the United States there. And I think this is the larger picture. If we see a declining role of the United States in the midterm and long run, we're still going to see these three countries still going at it.
Yoichi, it seems you are talking about an arms race that is spinning out of control, but to our knowledge, since the end of the Second World War, the ROK and Japan have enjoyed the military umbrella from the U.S. You have been able to save a lot of the money for your domestic economic reconstruction, the post-war reconstruction. Why this time around you don't trust the U.S. any longer and start thinking seriously about your own military build-up?
Well, because the U.S. strategy has changed from forward-basing frontline strategy to now where their new thinking is to pull back and to position their ships and aircraft behind the Okinawan archipelago and fire at China from there with longer range missiles and with tanker refueled planes. And that precisely puts Japanese troops and South Korean troops as the front line, on the very front, and the U.S. would be behind them. And this is why I think the Prime Minister Khan is trying to say, hold on, wait a minute, that's not how the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty works. You guys, you Americans are supposed to be on the front line, and we're here to support you. So this, I think, is a changing scenario that's causing a lot of alarm in East Asia, and I think the South Koreans feel the same way, that they're finding themselves at the front and the Americans behind them.
With the artillery clash in the disputed waters of the Korean Peninsula, the Korean President Lee Myung-bak has decided to postpone the transfer of wartime command from the ROK military to the U.S. military. But let's come back to examine the perspective of the U.S. Do you think this is a conspiracy theory involved here? The Japanese complain a lot about being used as a shield.
I think we're in the classic catch-22. You have some commentators saying that the United States is pulling back to the other side of Japan, thus putting Japan at the front lines and thus really changing the dynamic of that umbrella. On the opposite end of that spectrum, you have the Chinese saying, well, look, we want the American ships out of the western seas of Japan because that's too close to China. So when the United States tries to make one party happy, they seem to be making the other party very, very unhappy. Further, you have the emergence of a stronger, for instance, South Korea. South Korea was at the forefront of a deal that was supposed to pull American troops back from the DMZ a number of years ago. Now, escalating tensions with North Korea have delayed that deal, but that deal was very much at the behest of the South Koreans, and it was at the request of the South Koreans that the deal was delayed. Further, when you have the Okinawan issue, you have the Japanese themselves sort of split over this issue. You have half of the population saying we want to keep the Okinawan base, and then you have the obvious residents of Okinawa pushing the Americans off of the island. So this sort of mixed signals put the U.S. in a very difficult situation. No matter where they put their ships, whether on the east side of Japan or on the west side of Japan, they're going to make somebody unhappy. So right now they've kind of done a bit of both. They've kept the USS George Washington out of the western seas of Korea for the last set of military maneuvers, mostly at the behest of China. Then after the escalating tensions with North Korea, they put the ships back in the western seas, something that China actually fairly gracefully kind of kept quiet on, because they said, look, we understand that at least in the immediate term this was understandable.
Do you believe the Chinese military quietly understands the presence of U.S. aircraft carrier in the Western Sea, or in Chinese words, the Yellow Sea?
No, I don't.
Can we accept that?
No. The problem is that whether you can accept it or not, it is not violate the international law.
It does not violate.
This is a very, very sensitive area.
Very controversial and
very
sensitive
area.
Why?
And it's controversial.
Why do you think it's sensitive?
Because it will record the Chinese the bitter history, because all the imperialist powers invaded China from this area, and we Chinese do not hope to see the repeat of the history.
So
secondly, I think this exercise is not only intended against North Korea, because it's not necessary for them to use such a large-scale forces, and to some degree, it is intended to carry out reconnaissances and the practice of the cooperation and coordination between the armed forces of different countries. In case of war breaks out in the future, they may use this sort of cooperation and coordination, I think.
What do you think of the transparency of the strategic moves by the Americans and their allies in Northeast Asia about deploying aircraft carriers in an area which is so close to China, which can easily invoke our bitter memories about the past?
Well, I think that the United States military and the United States government is trying to be somewhat sensitive of it, but the short-term problem is North Korea, North Korea, North Korea. It's always going to be that, and at least for the next year or two. And the reality is that, yes, they probably put more ships involved than they needed from a bare minimum basis, but the whole point was to show strength to North Korea. So when you're trying to show strength to someone, you go overboard with it. Further, honestly, when you're looking at who's getting the better tactical view of the other country, China is getting a front row seat to watching South Korea's Navy, the Japanese Navy and the United States Navy operating right in its front yard. So really, when you're looking at who has the better view from an intelligence point of view, China is getting a first-hand view of this cooperation and getting a real transparent understanding of how these navies will operate in the open ocean.
You accept his view that China enjoys the easy access to their intelligence militarily?
Generally speaking, I do not agree. But specifically speaking, with regard to this exercise, I think this sort of aircraft carriers provide China with their hypothetical tact. Actually, we can use this to train our troops.
Well, Yoichi, you've been so quiet and silent. I enjoy your voice and your criticism, but tell us your thoughts about the military maneuvers there and what they mean for the future of the security scenario in Northeast Asia.
Again, I think that's sort of a mask in a certain sense, that this tough appearance of toughness, this show is a show of strength, it's a show, but behind the scenes, I think the thinking among military strategists and among political leaders in Japan, South Korea, and the United States is that this $14 trillion American national debt, $1 trillion a year, of which 3/4 of that is defense spending, and if you combine it with defense intelligence, that eventually, well, not eventually, sooner rather than later, the budget's got to be cut. American defense spending is going to be cut, and that's going to leave a power vacuum in East Asia, and people are scrambling now to figure out how to fill this vacuum. So this is why people are acting tough, putting on this show. Whether or not China, Japan, Korea, North Korea Taiwan and all can enter into, and Russia can enter into some sort of security forum, that's the issue.
Thanks a lot. After all, Secretary Robert Gates has been able to deepen the security alliance between the two powers, Japan and the US, over the alleged threats from the DPRK, and citing the PRC's military buildup as a serious concern. We'll keep the dialogue open for further discussions, but until then, I'm Yang Rui. Goodbye.